Don't translate. You'll get it wrong. The words didn't just land, they sliced clean through the polished quiet of the Grand Regent Hotel lobby, sharper than the clink of crystal glasses, colder than the marble beneath every polished shoe, and for a moment, everything stopped. Conversations froze mid-sentence, a server paused with a tray suspended in the air. Even the soft piano in the corner seemed to hesitate as Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair like a man who had never once been misunderstood in his life, his tailored navy suit catching the warm gold light as he switched effortlessly into rapid Mandarin, each syllable precise, deliberate, and just fast enough to leave the room behind. Linda Brooks, the manager, forced a smile that cracked at the edges, her fingers tightening around a tablet she suddenly couldn't read. Her training, her experience, her confidence, none of it mattered now, because the language itself had become a wall and she was locked on the wrong side of it. And Ethan knew it. His eyes scanned the room, not searching for help but for confirmation that no one here could match him, that control was still his, always his. And then his gaze drifted, slow and dismissive, landing on someone no one else had noticed. Naomi Carter, standing near the edge of the room with a mop in her hand, her uniform simple, her presence quieter than the hum of the air conditioning, the kind of quiet people mistake for emptiness. She had been there the whole time, moving between reflections and shadows, wiping away footprints that cost more than her weekly paycheck, invisible by design, invisible by expectation, and yet her eyes, steady, observant, had been tracking every word, every tone, every subtle shift in Ethan's voice, because silence, for her, had never meant absence, it meant control. Ethan's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, more like a verdict. Some people are meant to clean floors, he said, his voice now back in English, smooth, casual, almost polite if you didn't listen too closely, not understand million-dollar conversations. A few quiet chuckles slipped out, the kind that follow power, not humor. Linda exhaled nervously, eager to move past the moment, to recover, to regain footing, but the air had already changed, something unspoken, something heavier, and then it happened, so small it almost didn't register at first. Naomi stopped moving, not dramatically, not to make a scene, just a pause, half a second, the kind that only matters when everything else is perfectly still. Her grip on the mop loosened, then steadied. She lifted her head, not fast, not slow, just enough, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, it didn't ask for permission, it simply existed. Clear, calm, undeniable. Sir, she said, in Mandarin so precise it didn't just match Ethan's, it cut cleaner. The clause you just mentioned contains a critical error, and just like that, the room changed sides. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was watching, waiting, holding its breath as the man who had owned every second until now slowly turned to face the one person he had already dismissed. No one moved, not because they were told to, but because something invisible had just shifted and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Ethan Caldwell studied her now, really studied her, not as part of the background, not as a passing inconvenience, but as a variable he had not accounted for. His expression did not collapse, it recalibrated, the slight tilt of his head, the narrowing of his eyes, the pause before he responded. All signs of a man who did not lose control, only adjusted it. Say that again, he replied in Mandarin, slower this time, deliberate, testing, the kind of tone used when someone expects a mistake to reveal itself. But Naomi did not hesitate. She stepped forward just enough to be seen without asking to be invited, her posture straight, her voice even. The liability clause you referenced shifts the risk entirely onto your partner, but the phrasing you used makes it unenforceable under standard Beijing commercial law. Her pronunciation was not just fluent. It was regionally precise, the kind that did not come from apps or casual study. It came from time, immersion, discipline, and that was when the room felt it, not just surprise, but recognition, because fluency can impress, but precision commands attention. Linda's tablet lowered slowly, her mouth slightly open, as if she had been waiting her entire career for someone to rescue this moment but never imagined it would be her, and certainly not from someone holding a mop 10 seconds ago. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in focus. And how exactly would you correct it? He asked, still in Mandarin, still controlled, but no longer dismissive. Naomi answered without raising her voice, each word placed carefully. You would need to restructure the clause to include mutual liability triggers and specify jurisdictional arbitration, otherwise it collapses under dispute. She paused, not for effect, but because she was done, because she did not need to prove anything beyond the truth. And that was when the silence deepened, not empty, not uncertain, but full, as if the room itself had leaned in to listen. A man near the back slowly lowered his glass, another shifted in his seat, not from discomfort, but from realization, and Linda, still frozen between relief and disbelief, finally whispered, "Oh my God," barely audible, but enough, because the shift was complete now. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a small controlled breath, the kind that resets a situation. He switched back to English. Not because he had to, but because now the audience mattered. "That is a very specific observation," he said, his voice calm but sharpened. "Where did you learn that?" The question hung there, heavier than the ones before, because this was no longer about language, it was about identity, about position, about how someone invisible had just stepped into the center without asking permission. Naomi met his gaze without challenge and without submission, just steady, just present. And for the first time since he had entered the room, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the only one in control of it. The question did not echo, it settled, heavy and deliberate, and for a moment Naomi said nothing, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the weight behind the question was not curiosity, it was calibration. Ethan Caldwell was not asking what she knew, he was measuring where she belonged, and the room felt it, that quiet tension that stretches just before something breaks or becomes something else entirely. Naomi's fingers rested lightly against the handle of the mop. Not gripping it anymore, just touching it, as if it no longer defined her role in the space. Her voice, when it came, was calm, unhurried. "I learned it where precision matters," she said, her eyes steady, and that was all at first. No long explanation, no attempt to impress, just a statement that refused to shrink itself. Ethan watched her closely, searching for hesitation, for inconsistency, for anything that would return the balance to what it had been, but there was none, only clarity, and that was what unsettled him, because clarity does not ask for approval. Linda shifted beside him, still holding her tablet like it might anchor her back into control, but the moment had already moved past her. One of the investors at the table leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing indifference. Another adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware that something significant was unfolding in a place where nothing significant was supposed to happen. Ethan's voice lowered, not softer, but more focused. "That is not something people pick up casually," he said, his words measured. "You are not just someone who studied Mandarin." Naomi met his gaze again, not with defiance, not with pride, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has already lived the answer. "No, I am not," she replied. And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have. A faint shift passed through the room, like a current changing direction, because now it was not just about what she could do, it was about who she had been before anyone in this room decided who she was allowed to be. Ethan took a step closer, not invading, but entering her space in a way that acknowledged it existed. "Then who are you?" he asked, and this time the question did not carry challenge, it carried something else, something unfamiliar, something closer to respect. Naomi paused, just long enough for the room to feel the answer before it was spoken. Her eyes flicked briefly to the polished floor beneath them, to the reflections of people who had never once looked down long enough to see her, and then back up. "I used to review contracts that looked exactly like yours," she said, her Mandarin returning for just a single phrase, precise and effortless, as if to remind everyone that what they had just witnessed was not a moment, it was a truth, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization. Ethan's expression shifted again, not breaking, but opening, just slightly, just enough to show that for the first time that night, he was no longer ahead of the story, and in that shift, in that quiet, controlled unraveling of certainty, the room understood something it had ignored until now. Power does not always enter loudly, sometimes it stands in the corner, holding a mop, waiting for the exact moment when it no longer needs to. The room did not erupt, it tightened, like every person inside it had just realized they were standing on something they did not understand, and no one wanted to be the first to move. Ethan Caldwell held her gaze a second longer than necessary, not out of dominance, but because he was recalculating, every detail, every word, every assumption he had made in the last 10 minutes quietly folding in on itself. "You reviewed contracts," he repeated, slower now, as if saying it differently might change what it meant. Naomi did not nod, did not elaborate, she simply stood there, steady, letting the truth exist without decoration, and that was what made it land harder, because people who exaggerate fill silence, but people who know do not need to. Linda finally stepped forward, her voice cautious, almost unsure of its place in the moment. "Wait, you are saying you worked in law?" she asked, her words careful, like she was stepping onto uncertain ground. Naomi glanced at her briefly, not dismissing her, but not shifting focus either. I worked where details mattered more than titles, she said, and again, she did not offer more, because she understood something the room was only beginning to learn. Explanation is often used to earn respect, but clarity does not need permission. One of the investors let out a quiet breath, the kind people release when they realize they have underestimated something important. Another leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, not defensive, but thoughtful, as if re-watching the last few minutes in his head and finding a different meaning in each second. Ethan's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders easing, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Then you understand what is at stake here, he said, and for the first time, there was no edge in his voice, no test hidden between his words, just a statement. Naomi answered without hesitation, yes, and the simplicity of it carried more authority than anything louder could have, because she did not say it like someone hoping to be believed, she said it like someone who had already carried consequences. Ethan glanced down at the contract in his hand, the same document that had felt like leverage minutes ago, now just paper, just ink, just something that could be wrong, and that realization, quiet as it was, shifted the weight of the room again. Linda looked between them, her confusion now turning into something closer to respect. Why are you working here? She asked, and this time the question did not come from doubt, it came from genuine curiosity. Naomi paused, not because the answer was difficult, but because it was not simple. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, the polished surfaces, the carefully controlled environment, the people who had never once considered the story standing beside them, because sometimes the place people stop looking is the place you see the most, she said, her voice calm, reflective, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood something had just been said that did not fit neatly into their expectations. Ethan looked at her again, differently now. Not as a disruption, not as a surprise, but as someone who had just changed the direction of a conversation he thought he controlled, and in that quiet shift, something rare happened, not a loss of power, but a recognition of it, shared, unexpected, undeniable. The air did not return to normal, it reassembled itself around a new center, and that center was no longer where anyone expected it to be. Ethan Caldwell looked down at the contract again, but this time not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as something that needed to be understood, truly understood, and that alone marked the shift, because men like him did not revisit details unless something forced them to, and Naomi Carter had done that without raising her voice, without stepping out of line. Without asking for anything in return, she had simply spoken, and the truth had done the rest. Show me, Ethan said finally, his tone measured, not commanding, not dismissive, but deliberate, as if the next step mattered more than the last. Naomi did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this moment was different. This was no longer interruption, this was invitation. And those two things carry very different weight. She set the mop aside gently, not discarding it, not rejecting it, just placing it where it belonged for now, and stepped closer to the table. The soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor somehow louder than anything that had been said. Linda instinctively shifted to the side, making space without realizing she had done it, and that was when the room felt it again, not surprise this time, but recognition, the kind that comes when a role quietly changes in front of you. Ethan turned the contract toward her, his hand steady, his eyes watching, not for mistakes, but for confirmation. Naomi leaned in slightly, her gaze scanning the page, not quickly, not slowly, just precisely, like someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Her finger traced a single line, stopping at a clause most would have overlooked. Here, she said, her voice calm. This phrasing creates a loophole. It allows either party to reinterpret the liability under dispute. Ethan followed her finger, his brow tightening just slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. She continued, if this goes to arbitration, it will not hold, and you will lose leverage immediately. The words landed clean, without exaggeration, without performance, and that was what made them impossible to ignore. One of the investors leaned forward again, this time openly, no longer pretending disinterest. Another quietly pulled out his phone, not to check messages, but to take a closer look at the document as if seeing it for the first time. Linda exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders releasing just enough to reveal something new, respect, not forced, not reluctant, but real. Ethan's thumb brushed lightly against the edge of the paper as he absorbed what she had said, then he nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried weight. And your correction, he asked, his voice steady, Naomi did not look up immediately. She adjusted the page slightly, aligning it as if preparing it for clarity. Mutual liability triggers, she replied, clearly defined arbitration jurisdiction, and removal of ambiguous phrasing. She tapped the line once, gently. Right now, this contract assumes control, but it does not secure it. Silence followed, not empty, but full, like a room that had just learned something it could not unlearn. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer scanning for weakness, but acknowledging strength, and in that moment, something quiet but undeniable settled over the room, the understanding that power had not been lost, it had been revealed, just not where anyone had been looking. No one spoke right away, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something deeper had taken hold, something that does not rush, something that settles, and in that stillness, Ethan Caldwell tapped the edge of the contract lightly against the table, once, twice, not impatiently, but thoughtfully, as if each tap marked a shift in how he was seeing the situation unfold. You are right, he said finally, the word simple, controlled, but unmistakable, and it was not just agreement. It was acknowledgement, the kind that does not come easily to someone used to being the sharpest mind in every room. Linda glanced at him, surprised not by the correction, but by the acceptance of it, because she had worked with Ethan long enough to know that he did not concede lightly, not to competitors, not to partners, and certainly not to someone he had dismissed minutes ago. But here he was, not resisting, not deflecting, just absorbing, and that alone shifted the energy again. One of the investors leaned back slowly, a faint smile forming, not amused, but impressed. Another nodded to himself, quietly recalculating what this meant for the deal, because the conversation had changed. It was no longer about language barriers or presentation, it was about precision, about risk, about who truly understood what was on the table. Ethan turned the contract back toward himself, his fingers smoothing the page as if resetting the terms in his own mind. If I revise this, he said, his voice steady, the leverage shifts back to me. It was not a question, but there was space for confirmation. Naomi gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not seeking recognition, just accurate. Yes, she replied, but only if the structure is clean, otherwise it creates a different vulnerability. Her tone remained even, the same tone she had used from the beginning, because for her, nothing had changed. She was not performing. She was not stepping into a new role. She was simply continuing to be who she had always been. The room, however, was catching up. Linda lowered her tablet completely now, no longer pretending to manage the situation, because it was clear that management had shifted, not officially, not visibly, but undeniably. Ethan studied Naomi again, not with skepticism, not with dismissal, but with something closer to curiosity. You see things most people miss, he said, and this time there was no edge, no hidden test, just observation. Naomi did not smile, she did not deflect, she simply answered, most people are not looking, and that landed differently than anything before it, because it was not just about contracts anymore, it was about perspective, about attention, about the quiet spaces where real understanding lives. A subtle ripple moved through the room, not loud, not obvious, but present, the kind of shift that happens when people realize they have been overlooking something important for far too long. Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture no longer asserting control, but acknowledging balance. Then I have been looking in the wrong place, he said, almost to himself, and for a moment, that admission hung in the air, not heavy, but clear, because it marked something rare, not a loss of authority, but an expansion of it, the kind that comes when certainty makes room for truth. Naomi stepped back half a step, not retreating, just creating space again, returning the focus to where it needed to be, because she understood something the room was only beginning to grasp. Power is not proven by holding attention, it is proven by knowing when to release it. And as the conversation shifted forward, no one in that room saw her as invisible anymore, not because she demanded it, but because she never needed to. The conversation did not return to normal, it evolved, and with that evolution came something far more dangerous than arrogance, awareness. Ethan Caldwell rested his hand flat on the contract now, not gripping it, not using it as a shield, just holding it in place as if grounding himself in the reality that had just shifted beneath him. Then let us fix it properly, he said, his voice calm but carrying a new weight. Not the weight of authority, but the weight of intention, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Linda straightened slightly, her instincts pulling her back toward structure, toward order, but even she understood that whatever came next would not follow the script she was used to. One of the investors leaned forward again, this time fully engaged, his earlier detachment replaced by a quiet focus, because the stakes had just become clearer. not just financially, but intellectually. Ethan glanced at Naomi, not to test her, not to challenge her, but to include her. Walk me through it, he said, and this time it was not a command, it was a request. Naomi stepped forward once more, not hesitant, not eager, just aligned with the moment, her presence steady as she reached for a pen resting near the edge of the table. She did not ask permission, not out of disrespect, but because none was needed anymore. She turned the contract slightly, positioning it so both of them could see clearly, and began to mark the page with small, precise adjustments, each movement intentional. Each note placed exactly where it needed to be. This clause needs to mirror the liability threshold, she explained, her voice even, otherwise it creates imbalance under review. Ethan watched closely, not interrupting, not redirecting, just observing, the way someone does when they recognize expertise and choose to learn from it. Linda stepped closer as well, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something quieter, more grounded. Respect that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with clarity. Naomi continued, outlining the revision step by step, not simplifying, not over-explaining, just presenting the structure as it was meant to be seen. And as she spoke, something else began to happen. The room was no longer reacting, it was following, every word, every adjustment, every subtle correction pulling the focus tighter, sharper, until the noise of the lobby itself seemed distant, irrelevant. One of the investors nodded slowly, another scribbled notes of his own, as if trying to keep up with the precision unfolding in front of them. Ethan finally leaned in slightly, his attention fully engaged. And this secures jurisdiction, he said, more to confirm than to question. Naomi gave a small nod. Yes, it removes ambiguity and protects both sides from reinterpretation. The exchange was seamless now, no longer divided by position or expectation. Just two people working through a problem with equal clarity, and that was the moment the room truly understood what had changed. Not just the contract, not just the conversation, but the structure of attention itself, because power had not been taken, it had been recognized, and recognition, once given, cannot be undone. Ethan set the pen down gently, his gaze lingering on the revised sections before lifting back to Naomi. You should not be doing this job, he said, not as a dismissal, not as a judgment, but as a realization spoken out loud. Naomi paused just for a fraction of a second, then answered with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, I am doing exactly the job I chose. And that answer did not challenge him, it expanded the moment, because it reminded everyone in the room that position does not define capability, and silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it is control. And as the final adjustment settled into place, the contract now something entirely different from what it had been minutes ago, the room did not return to its previous state, it moved forward, carrying with it the quiet understanding that the person they had overlooked had not just corrected a document, she had redefined the terms of the entire conversation. The final mark on the page did not feel like an ending, it felt like a beginning, the kind that does not announce itself but settles quietly into place. And as Naomi lifted the pen and set it down beside the contract, the room held its breath for a moment longer than necessary, as if no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened. Ethan Caldwell looked at the revised document, not scanning, not searching, just taking it in, the clean structure, the balanced clauses, the absence of ambiguity, and for the first time that evening, the deal in front of him matched the level of control he was used to having. But this time, he had not built it alone. This holds, he said finally, his voice low but certain, and the words carried more weight than any earlier statement he had made, because they were not about confidence, they were about truth. Linda exhaled quietly, a breath she had been holding far longer than she realized, her shoulders easing as she looked at the contract, then at Naomi, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the two realities that had just collided. One of the investors leaned forward and tapped the table lightly. Then we proceed, he said, his tone measured but firm, and just like that, the deal was no longer uncertain, it was aligned, but the alignment had not come from where anyone expected. Ethan nodded once, then reached for his pen, signing his name with the same precision he applied to everything else, but this time, there was a subtle shift, not in the motion, but in the meaning behind it, because he knew, and everyone in that room knew, that the signature on that page was not just his, not entirely. Naomi stepped back again, returning to the space she had occupied before, but it was not the same space anymore, not invisible, not overlooked, just quieter, intentional. And as she reached for the mop she had set aside, the contrast did not diminish her, it defined her. Because she had never needed to step out of her role to prove her worth, she had simply expanded what that role could mean. Ethan watched her for a moment, not lingering, not staring, just acknowledging, and then he spoke again, not to the room, not to the investors, but to her. "Naomi," he said, using her name for the first time, and that alone shifted something subtle but significant. "You changed the outcome of this deal." His tone was not exaggerated, not performative, just direct. Naomi paused, her hand resting lightly on the mop handle, then looked at him, her expression unchanged, calm, steady. "No," she replied, "I clarified it, and that distinction mattered, because it removed ego from the moment and replaced it with purpose." Ethan gave a small nod, accepting the correction without resistance, because by now, he understood something he had not when the night began. Precision is not loud, it does not demand attention, it earns it. Linda stepped forward slightly, her voice softer now, more grounded. "We would not have seen that," she admitted, and it was not a confession of failure, it was an acknowledgement of perspective. Naomi offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, not proud, not dismissive, just present. "Most people would not," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only truth. The room settled again, but this time the silence was different, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if everyone there was quietly recalibrating how they saw the space around them, the people within it, and the assumptions they carried without question. Ethan closed the folder gently, the deal complete, the terms secured, but the night far from ordinary, and as conversation slowly began to return, softer now, more measured, there was one thing none of them could ignore. The person they had not seen when they walked in had become the one they would remember when they left. The room slowly began to breathe again, but it was not the same rhythm it had before. Conversations returned in softer tones, more measured, as if every word now had to pass through a new awareness before being spoken. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his fingers resting lightly on the closed folder, not opening it again, not needing to, because the deal was done, but something else had opened in its place. Something less tangible and far more difficult to ignore. He looked across the room, not scanning for status or advantage, but observing, really observing, the people, the movement, the small details that had always been there but rarely noticed, and then his gaze found her again, Naomi Carter, already back in motion, already returning to the quiet rhythm of her work, the mop gliding across the marble floor with the same precision she had applied to the contract, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Linda stood nearby, watching Naomi for a brief second before catching herself and turning back to her responsibilities. But even in that small hesitation, there was something new, something that had not been there before, recognition, not forced, not performative, just real. One of the investors leaned toward another, speaking in a low voice, not dismissive, not amused, but thoughtful, as if the conversation they were having now carried a different kind of weight than the one they had started with. Ethan finally stood, adjusting his jacket slightly, a familiar gesture. But this time it did not carry the same certainty it had when he first walked in, not because he had lost anything, but because he had gained something he had not expected, perspective, and that has a way of reshaping even the smallest movements. He took a few steps forward, not toward the exit, not toward the investors, but toward Naomi, the distance between them closing quietly, without urgency, without spectacle. Naomi noticed him before he spoke, not because she was watching for him, but because she was always aware, always present in the space around her. She stopped, lifting the mop slightly to the side, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this moment carried no more weight than any other. Ethan paused in front of her, just long enough to make it clear that this was intentional, that this was not an afterthought. "You said you chose this job," he began, his voice steady, but different now, less certain of its own conclusions, more open to what it might discover. Naomi nodded once, a small movement, but enough. Ethan continued, "Most people would not make that choice," he said, and it was not a judgment, not a challenge, just an observation shaped by everything he had believed until now. Naomi looked at him for a moment, her gaze steady but not confrontational. And then she answered, "Most people choose what they are seen doing," she said, her voice calm. "I chose what lets me see." The word settled between them, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like everything else she had said, and for a second, Ethan did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because he understood. An understanding, when it is real, does not rush to fill silence, it sits with it. He gave a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just genuine, and then he stepped back, not turning away immediately, but allowing the moment to exist fully before Moving on, Naomi returned to her work without hesitation, without lingering, the mop gliding across the floor once more, but now every movement carried a different meaning for those who had witnessed what had happened, because they were no longer seeing just a task, they were seeing intention, skill, choice, and as Ethan walked toward the exit, the soft echo of his footsteps blending back into the rhythm of the lobby, there was one thing he knew with absolute clarity, the most important detail. In the room had never been on the page, it had been standing right in front of him all along, waiting for the moment he finally learned how to look. The night should have ended there, clean, controlled, resolved, but moments like that do not disappear quietly, they linger, they follow, they settle into the spaces people carry with them long after they leave, and Ethan Caldwell felt it as he stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting off glass towers that had always made sense to him, sharp lines, clear structures, predictable outcomes. But tonight something did not fit as neatly as it used to. He paused on the top step, not checking his phone, not rushing to his car, just standing there for a second longer than his usual rhythm allowed, because his mind was not on the deal anymore. It was on her, not as a surprise, not as a disruption, but as a question he had not yet answered. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere had softened, conversations had resumed, but not quite as loudly, not quite as confidently. Linda Brooks stood near the reception desk, watching the last of the investors gather their things, her posture composed, her expression professional, but her thoughts somewhere else entirely. She replayed the moment again and again, the pause, the voice, the precision, and the realization that she had been standing inches away from something she had not recognized until it was undeniable. She glanced across the floor, finding Naomi again, still working, still moving with that same steady rhythm, as if the night had not rewritten itself around her, and that was what unsettled Linda the most, not what Naomi had done, but how little she needed it to change anything about who she was. Naomi, Linda called out softly, her voice no longer carrying authority, just intention. Naomi stopped, turning slightly, her expression calm, present. Linda hesitated for half a second, not out of uncertainty, but because she wanted to get it right. "Why did you not say anything sooner?" she asked, and the question held no accusation, only curiosity shaped by everything she had just witnessed. Naomi considered it for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood that answers, like moments, have weight depending on when they are given. Because no one was asking the right question, she said simply, and that answer did not just explain the moment, it reframed it, because it was not about silence, it was about timing. Linda nodded slowly, absorbing that, realizing that leadership is not always about speaking first, sometimes it is about knowing when to listen long enough for truth to surface. Outside, Ethan finally moved, descending the steps with a measured pace. But before he reached his car, he stopped again, turning back toward the glass doors, his reflection staring back at him, composed, successful, unchanged on the surface, but something behind that reflection had shifted, not broken, not weakened, just expanded. He pulled out his phone, paused, then put it away again, because this was not a message he wanted to send through a screen, this was something that required presence. Inside, Naomi returned to her work, the mop gliding across the marble floor, but her mind was not on the contract, not on the investors, not even on Ethan. It was on the quiet certainty that had guided her through the night, the understanding that value does not need to announce itself to exist, it only needs the right moment to be seen. And as the lobby lights reflected softly across the polished surface, one truth settled into place, clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. The most powerful voice in the room had been the one no one thought to listen for, until it was too late to overlook it. The lobby lights dimmed slightly as the night edged closer to closing, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with that quiet shift that only those paying attention ever notice, and Naomi Carter noticed, not because it changed her routine, but because she had always understood how environments speak without words. The polished floor now reflected fewer footsteps, fewer conversations, fewer distractions, and in that thinning space, clarity had room to breathe. Linda Brooks stood by the reception desk longer than necessary, her usual efficiency replaced by something slower, more deliberate, as if she was relearning how to observe the very place she had managed for years. Her eyes followed Naomi again, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect that had not been there before, a respect that came not from position, but from realization, because tonight had quietly rewritten the hierarchy she thought she understood. Outside, Ethan Caldwell had not left, not yet. He stood just beyond the glass doors, his reflection faint against the city lights, his phone still in his hand but unused, because for the first time in a long time, action did not come from urgency, it came from intention, and intention requires stillness. He turned back, not quickly, not impulsively, just enough to acknowledge that something unfinished remained inside, and as he stepped through the doors again, the sound of the lobby shifted, not louder, but sharper, as if the space itself recognized his return. Carried a different purpose, Naomi heard the doors open, but she did not look up immediately, not because she did not know who it was, but because she understood that presence does not need to rush to meet attention, it can allow attention to come to it. Ethan walked across the marble floor with a steadier pace than before, not driven by control, but by clarity, and when he reached her, he did not speak right away. He waited, just a fraction of a second, long enough to show that this moment was chosen, not assumed. "I was going to leave," he said finally, his voice calm, stripped of the edge it carried earlier, but something did not sit right. Naomi looked up then, meeting his gaze with the same quiet steadiness that had never left her, not questioning, not inviting, just present. Ethan continued. "I have spent years making decisions based on what I see," he said, the words measured, as if each one was being weighed before it was released, "and tonight made it clear that I have not been seeing everything." The admission did not sound like defeat, it sounded like correction, the kind that shifts direction rather than stopping momentum. Naomi listened without interrupting, because she understood that some realizations need space to fully form. Ethan took a small breath, not to steady himself, but to mark the moment. "I want to offer you something," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no calculation, just intention. The room did not freeze like before, but it leaned, subtly, as if every person still present felt the weight of what was about to be said. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, not eager, not resistant, just grounded, because she had never been waiting for an offer. She had only been present for the moment that required her. Ethan held her gaze, not asserting, not testing, just acknowledging, and in that quiet exchange, something became clear to everyone watching. This was no longer about a contract, or a mistake, or even a moment of unexpected brilliance. This was about what happens when perception catches up to reality, and reality, once seen, does not return to being invisible. The offer did not arrive with urgency, it arrived with weight, the kind that settles before it is even spoken, and in that quiet space between intention and words, Ethan Caldwell held Naomi's gaze, not to persuade her, not to impress her, but to make it clear that what he was about to say mattered. "Come work with me," he said finally, his voice steady, stripped of performance, not a support, not behind the scenes, but where decisions are made. The words hung in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they were shocked, but because they understood the significance of what had just been placed on the table. Linda Brooks inhaled slowly, her eyes shifting between them, recognizing that this was not just an opportunity, it was a shift in trajectory, the kind that does not come twice. The investors nearby remained silent, not out of disinterest, but out of respect for the moment, because even they knew this was no longer about business alone. Naomi listened, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and that calm carried more strength than excitement ever could, because she was not reacting, she was considering, and consideration is where real decisions are made. Ethan continued, not rushing, not filling the silence. "You see what others miss," he said, "you understand structure, risk, language, and more importantly, you know when to speak." He paused, letting that settle. "That is not something I can teach, but it is something I value." His tone remained even, but the meaning behind it was clear. This was not charity, not recognition for a moment, it was acknowledgement of capability. Naomi let a small breath pass, not heavy, not emotional, just present. Her eyes briefly moved across the room, the polished floors, the quiet corners, the space that had allowed her to observe, to learn, to understand without interruption. And then she looked back at him. "And what happens when I no longer see what you expect me to see?" she asked, her voice calm, but precise, and the question did not challenge the offer, it clarified it, because it removed assumption and replaced it with truth. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he lacked a response, but because he respected the question enough to consider it fully. "Then you tell me," he said finally, "because that is the point," and that answer shifted the moment again, not into agreement, but into understanding, because it revealed something deeper than opportunity, it revealed alignment. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, measuring not the words, but the intention behind them, and in that brief silence, the entire room seemed to narrow to just that exchange. the kind that defines direction long before any decision is spoken. Linda watched closely, not anticipating an answer, but recognizing that whatever came next would not follow expectation. Naomi's hand rested lightly against the handle of the mop, a quiet reminder of where she stood, not physically, but by choice, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty it had from the beginning. "I did not step forward tonight to change where I stand," she said. "I stepped forward because it was necessary." The words did not reject the offer, but they did not accept it either. They reframed it, because for Naomi, position had never been the goal. Purpose had, and purpose does not shift for convenience. Ethan listened, not interrupting, not persuading, just absorbing, because he understood now that value like hers does not move because it is asked to, it moves because it chooses to, and that distinction is what makes it rare. The room remained still, not waiting for a decision, but recognizing that the decision itself was not the point was the moment that had already changed everything, and in that moment, one truth became clear: opportunity does not define worth, it reveals whether worth was ever seen in the first place. The moment did not end with a decision, it settled into something quieter, something deeper, the kind of ending that does not close a story but reframes it. Ethan Caldwell stood there for a second longer, not expecting a yes, not pushing for one, because by now he understood something he had not when he first walked into that room. Value does not respond to pressure, it responds to recognition, and recognition had already happened. Naomi Carter remained steady, her hand still resting lightly on the handle of the mop, not as a symbol of limitation, but as a reminder of choice, because everything about her presence had been intentional from the start. She had not been waiting to be discovered, she had been waiting for the moment that required her, and when that moment came, she did not rise to prove herself, she simply revealed what had always been there. Linda Brooks watched the exchange quietly, no longer trying to interpret it, no longer trying to manage it, just understanding that some moments are not meant to be controlled, they are meant to be witnessed. The investors nearby had stopped speaking entirely, not out of obligation, but because they recognized that what they had just seen carried more weight than any agreement they had signed. Ethan gave a small nod, not formal, not final, just respectful. "Then you are exactly where you need to be," he said, and the words did not close the door, they opened something else, something that did not require immediate action, only acknowledgement. Naomi returned the nod, just as small, just as grounded, and that exchange carried more clarity than any contract ever could, because it was built on understanding, not expectation. Ethan turned then, not abruptly, not as a retreat, but as a continuation, walking toward the exit with a different pace than before, not faster, not slower, just aware, and as the glass doors opened and the city lights met him again, they no longer reflected just success, they reflected perspective. Inside, the lobby settled into its final rhythm of the night, quieter now, more reflective. Naomi resumed her work, the mop gliding across the marble floor with the same precision it always had. But for those who had seen, it was no longer just a task, it was a choice, a deliberate one, and that made all the difference. Linda took a slow breath, then turned back to her responsibilities, but not as the same manager who had stood there earlier. She carried something new now, not authority, but awareness, the kind that changes how you see every person who walks through the door, because once you understand that value does not announce itself, you start looking differently, and that is where everything changes. The night ended without applause, without spectacle, without anything that would mark it as extraordinary to anyone who had not been there, but for those who were, it was not something they would forget, not because of what was said, but because of what was revealed. That power does not always enter a room, sometimes it is already there, quiet, patient, waiting, and when it finally speaks, it does not need to be loud, it only needs to be true. She did not step forward to be seen. She stepped forward because it mattered, and that is why, when the moment came, the room did not just hear her, it understood her.